and I don't know if you can see, but in the background here there is a giant fire. That is in fact New York on fire right now. This is actually Manhattan that I'm sitting in, but because of the coronavirus everything's fucked. Hello and welcome to the Car Nerd Talks once again. Welcome on this fine Friday, and today I want to talk to you about something that's very, very important during this coronavirus crisis, and that is, of course, the 1992 to 1994 Jaguar XJ220, which is by far and away the best car Jaguar has ever made since the E-Type, and possibly better than the E-Type if it wasn't for being built in the wrong time. I think if it had been built in the 2000s, it probably would have beat out Lamborghini, but we'll get there in a moment, and we'll get to why it failed so monstrably as well. But before we get there, thank you for joining me today. If you're reading my article on drivetribe.com, thank you for that as well. I put very little work into these, and I essentially just sit ranting to myself here pretty much all the time, so all my lack of work that's gone into this is really, really appreciated. Thank you. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and every day now I'm going to be doing a video talking about something, and hopefully over the next few weeks I'll have some actual car videos as well once this coronavirus thing settles down. And I don't know if you can see, but in the background here there is a giant fire. That is in fact New York on fire right now. This is actually Manhattan that I'm sitting in, but because of the coronavirus everything's fucked. So this is the new Manhattan. That right there actually is Trump Tower. They tried to build it bigger, but Trump's not great with these old building things. So yeah, let's get into it. Let's get into it. Just checking my phone here. So, basically in the late 80s, there was an informal team of guys in Jaguar. And they were they were very interested in the racing team, and they wanted to build a modern interpretation of the Jaguars from the 50s and 60s that won the 24 Hours of Le Mans, because Jaguar were big in Le Mans for a while, and then Ferrari obviously were killing them because Enzo Ferrari didn't actually care about selling cars. He only sold cars as a means to win races, which is where the whole Ford versus Ferrari thing came from, and that's a story for a different day. Maybe we'll talk about the GT40 at some point. But essentially Ferrari came along and then started wiping the floor, then Ford came along, and then Maserati and Ferrari and all the Italians and the Americans. But for a long time, Jaguar was quite a big name in racing, and it still was in British racing, obviously. So when it came to British racing, Jaguar were very, very good. And then in the 60s, Jaguar started creating the Mark II, which the Cray twins used. If you don't know who the Cray twins are, definitely look those up. There's a couple of movies on Netflix I think you can watch, but basically the Italian mafia never came near London because they were terrified of these two brothers. It's an insane story. And that's where Jaguar, for example, got that kind of mean, kind of aggressive look from, and we're known as bank robbers and that kind of thing. So anyway, in the 60s, 50s and 60s, early 60s, late 50s, they had these really cool cars. And if you look at the XJ220, it's kind of going back to that styling of like where the E-Type was going. So what these guys wanted to do in their spare time was build a modern interpretation of those cars for Jaguar, and it was kind of built as a showcase of what it could do. So in 1991 they released the concept version of the XJ220, and the I think it was the XKJ9 or something. I can't remember the exact concept number, but this car was incredible. So they lapped that concept car in the Nuremberg ring in 7 minutes, which at the time was an incredible speed. But if you look at the car, it's really, really low down. It's fantastic, and it's built kind of like the old E-Types in that style, but it's got like the flat back. And this was by far and away my favorite car as a kid, before the 575, for example, came along, that I loved so much for no real reason. And I always thought that this was like a sensible man's Lamborghini. So if you wanted a Countach or a Diablo, kind of in terms of performance and cool styling, but you didn't quite want to look like you were a 30 or 40 or 50-year-old child, then this would have been the car to go for, because it's absolutely stunning, as you can see, and definitely one of the prettiest cars of the 90s. And for 1 year, from 1992 to 1993, this was the fastest production car ever made. Now, its top speed, or its 0 to 60, was 4.8 seconds, which in those days was incredibly fast. But the 0 to 60 wasn't the important bit. The top speed was the important bit. So, funnily enough, it was Top Gear on the BBC, as if you're reading Drive Tribe, you're probably aware of, and if you're watching this, you probably know what Top Gear is anyway. But those guys in the early 90s tested this car along with a couple of other television shows and test drivers, and they got a few racing drivers, and they decided to see how fast this thing would go, because Jaguar said 210 miles an hour, which would have made it, I think, still the fastest production car that you could just go out and buy. But it hit 217. So this car was actually 7 miles an hour faster than Jaguar, I thought, which is really, really cool. Now, obviously, about a year later, McLaren came out with the McLaren F1, and that went to 230, I believe it was, 235. And now, obviously, we've got a 300 mile an hour car with the Bugatti Chiron. Bugatti with their Charlize Theron. So yeah, like between now and then, it's funny actually, because those barriers to speed, they take a long time to deal with. So like, for example, 217 miles an hour in 1991, and now nearly 30 years later, you've got a 300 mile an hour car, and it's not that big of a difference when you think about it. So yeah, the Jaguar XJ220 was really ahead of its time, and obviously now I think the closest thing to it now would be the Bugatti Charlize Theron. So yeah, some problems though happened, because that was the 1991 concept car came along, and that had a V12, which was heavier. Now I wonder, would that have been faster? Like, would that have been a faster production car? I'm not sure. But essentially what happened was, in the years where this thing was being prepped for production, they had to make a lot of changes because there was a recession. Oil prices went flying through the roof, and they had to change the massive V12 that they had, which would have made it like a Lamborghini killer, to a V6. So they changed it to a V64 4-valve per cylinder V6 turbocharged engine. Now that engine still got it the 0 to 60 4.8 seconds and 217 mile an hour top speed. It made it the fastest production car in the world. But I would have loved to have seen what they would have done if they had been able to keep the V12. But it was just one of those things where emission standards and everything came in, and Jaguar physically wouldn't have been able to sell the V12. So they had to redesign a lot of things in the chassis and whatnot. So this car changed a lot. Now, Jaguar had taken a 50,000 sterling deposit from a lot of customers who wanted these things, but unfortunately, with all of the different changes and the emissions problem and everything, a lot of these customers decided, when it actually was released, that because of all the changes, it was an excuse for them to fight for their deposit back and not place an option to buy, because these were expensive cars. I think these were, these were close to £1 million cars, and definitely £1 million in today's money. So these were expensive cars. So eventually Jaguar did sell 275 of them over the 2 years before they killed it off, which is really unfortunate, because I think after that, obviously Jaguar was kind of handed around a lot, so the company changed quite a bit, and they make really, really beautiful cars now, but it's owned by Tata Motors and things changed. But the biggest thing for me that I find hilarious about this whole time in Jaguar's history is they managed to take the engine from from Austin. So this was still back when Jaguar was like Leyland vehicle, kind of proper British, a British manufacturer who made British cars, and very, very, very high end, very classy British cars, and you could decide not to pay for lunch because you drove a Jag. So this was a time when they were using engines that were from Austin's, so this was like Austin engines. Was it Austin? I'm gonna just check that, because that. Yeah, so the engine in these was from an Austin Rover that they had tuned up. So this is a weird time in British car history where they're using the same engines as a Rover in the fastest production car in the world. Now, obviously, it had been tweaked quite a bit. Yeah, but really, really beautiful car, and it was my favorite model car when I was a kid. I think I had one because I would have been 3 or 4 at the time, but I was obsessed with cars at that age, and I had a little one that my granddad had brought me home, and it was like all the doors open in the engine bay and everything was my favorite looking car. And yeah, it was just a beautiful, beautiful car. It had its interior, kind of one of the cars that had the interior like a cockpit, everything facing towards you. And one last interesting fact I'll give you. Well, I say interesting. It's about as interesting as Doug DeMuro, and he's probably already talked about this in his review. But essentially, the two side mirrors, they wanted to put them on the front, on the bonnet, like like old style cars where it's out here, as you can see here. But what happened was the driver side one they were able to do that, but the passenger side one they had to put on the door. So you have two different mirror placements, and this was because they didn't realize until they went into production that if you look this way, the pillar would actually block the mirror on that side. So yeah, very, very, very strange setup, but absolutely stunning car, and definitely still one of my favorites. So tell me what you think about Jaguar, and tell me what you think is their best car in the comments below, either here on YouTube or on my drivetribe.com article. And thank you again for watching, much appreciated. Have a great day. Have you liked and subscribed yet? Have you done it yet? No? Still nothing? How about now?